Unfiltered. I'm Jack Stockwell. I've got an hour to go through 3 hours worth of information for you this morning. As things continue to unfold hour by hour around the planet now, not day by day. I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to be here on behalf of K-Talk Radio, as well as Global Affairs Unfiltered on the stream. I will not be here tomorrow. I have arranged with Paul to play a replay of a health program. I will not be here tomorrow simply because I will be on my way to Chicago and on my way to the Standard Process Organic Farms. This is something absolutely to behold. To stand out in the middle of 9,500 acres of organic farming and smell the air and the oxygen that is coming from these plants. I'll be there for a few days. It's a celebration for those who are some of the top movers of standard process products, of which our clinic is. And I thank you for your patronage and for keeping us as busy as you keep us, offering up these products. We did a heart sound recorder on somebody yesterday who has been fit and full of vigor and vinegar his whole life, 71 years old, and all of a sudden is breaking down. Can't understand why. Weightlifter, land developer, golfer, hiker, and all of a sudden things in fact, he's almost hysterical. So we did a scan of his heart, and I said, look at that, your heart's silly putty. I realize that's not a medical term, but look at this scan of your heart. That's why. Because a lot of people think all they need is exercise. No, you have to feed the body. Exercise is not enough. The body must be fed. And it's impossible without supplementation. 50 years ago, yeah, you could get good food sources. Today, I'm sorry. My breakfast this morning was all the supplements that I take to keep me going at almost 75 years old. All right, now, tons of things to talk about. The Russian Foreign Ministry issued a statement just yesterday. Now get this. They're announcing that Russia is no longer feels bound by the moratorium it self-adopted, after President Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty back in 2019. The treaty that was signed by the U.S. and the Soviet Union back in 1987 banned all ground-launched missiles with ranges that fell between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. So after the U.S. then withdrew its observance of that agreement 6 years ago, Russia adopted a moratorium of its own deployment of such weapons. They didn't need a treaty. They just said, no, we'll have our own moratorium. We won't do it, provided that the equivalent U.S. systems do not appear at locations within INF range of Russia. So as long as you're not bringing those missiles here, to Europe, Eurasia, to the Pacific, we won't make them. Well, guess what? Missile systems are now within the INF range, 500 to 5,500 kilometers, beginning to appear both in Europe and the Western Pacific, as we are marching day by day closer to World War III, which I don't see any way out of it. We're on our way to war. And the Russians said the conditions for maintaining a unilateral moratorium on the deployment of similar systems have ceased to exist. Therefore, we are authorized to declare that the Russian Federation no longer considers itself bound by the previously adopted self-imposed restrictions. What does that mean? That means they can launch that Orishnik wherever they want. Now, the German Defense Minister, Boris Pistorius, said last Friday, I think it was, that Germany is going to back Ukraine with 2 more U.S. Patriot launchers and fork over additional Patriot system components in the next 2 to 3 months. Pistorius said this: the prerequisite was that the U.S. manufacturer would deliver new Patriot systems as quickly as possible in return so that we could continue to meet our NATO obligations. This commitment from the U.S. side has been made. This was reported on The Hill. Germany, therefore, will support Ukraine first with launchers and then with further Patriot system components. Once again, Germany is by far the strongest supporter of Ukraine in air defense. Well, doesn't that just make your day? And what does this mean? As I listen to the experts on various podcasts, some originating in America, some originating in Europe, some in Eurasia, where I get a lot of my information as well as the press. Anytime a missile is launched, like the Iskanders in Kaliningrad, towards a target, a defense or military target in the Ukraine, and they want to send a Patriot, they don't send one, they send two. These Patriots are extremely expensive, and they don't always hit the target. And when the Russians know that there are Patriots aimed at what they send up, they send 3 or 4 or 5 or a dozen in that same conglomerate to distract the Patriots from the real drone that's carrying the heaviest payload. It's just insane. It is just such a comedy of errors. The Laurel and Hardy of military defense. So when I read reports like that, we're going to give them Patriots. It's just, was a sound and fury signifying nothing, something, a tempest in a teapot kind of stuff, just to continue to engender the attention of the idiots in Congress to keep sending money to these poor Ukrainians. And you can continue to send them bullets. You can send them cannons, artillery, drones, their anti-aircraft, anti-missile missiles. One thing that they desperately need that we can't send them is manpower. And it doesn't matter how much actual military strength we continue to embolden them with. They're dying. And as soon as the Russians have control of Petrovsk, it's over with. And that's the one last battle that I'm looking at. Okay, some really good news for you. U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi has ordered that a grand jury now be formed to investigate and weigh grounds for criminal indictments on figures that are associated with Russiagate, according to several media reports yesterday. The Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, requested that this be done in mid-July, when Gabbard released the first set of declassified documents on the Russiagate episode, conducted against the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and promoting further confrontation with Russia. Now, no more details on the grand jury process are available at this particular time. However, the principles involved in crafting and promoting the Russia-Trump collusion hoax are well known, and it includes top Obama administration officials, former FBI Director Comey, intelligence officials Brennan and Clapper, and others. And now she has called for a grand jury investigation. What do you think is going to come of that? Her memorandum from July said that the declassified files showed evidence of suppression and manipulation of intelligence, in other words, lying, regarding the underlying assessments of Russian activities regarding the alleged interference in U.S. elections. Now, Gabbard forwarded the relevant files to the Department of Justice as part of a criminal referral to bring to justice those engaging in what she called treason. The process will now turn, and you know, if you know your Constitution, the penalties for treason. This process will now turn up the heat on U.S. collaborators in the ongoing British intelligence operation to manipulate the U.S. into confrontation with Russia, as well as to generally subvert U.S. institutions and media. So while this stuff brews and festers and ferments, and you know indictments will come out of this. The one overarching, undergirding force that needs to be indicted is the British Empire. All right, I was going to say something about India, because they just told Trump, we'll buy oil from whoever we damn well please. You can't tell us who we're going to buy our oil from. There's 300 in Sydney, Australia, 300,000 marched in a pro-Palestine rally. They called it the March for Humanity. Not only was it to bring attention to the genocide and the starvation of children in the Gaza, the ongoing starvation. I've got more information about that. It's also about the stranglehold of the IDF and the intention of the IDF to move back in full force, even though there's hardly any Hamas force left to resist them, in order to clean out what is left of the population. So they can move in and grab the gas leases and the oil leases. So this is a very dangerous, complicated, multifaceted situation. And the best that you can do, that I can do, in my opinion, is to keep our wits about us, to pay attention to the details, watch for the distractions. I think that there'll probably be a lot more hubbub coming out about these indictments, because the more the press focuses on that, and they will, the less they're going to focus on who it is that is blackmailing President Trump to do the things that he's doing. The Mossad, the Epstein saga, the Epstein papers and files. Anytime, I kind of wax cynical when I get into this area, but anytime I see some new thing take over the radar, it's because something else is not necessarily dropping off the radar. It's being covered up, just like a stealth. And one of the things that are going to be covered up heavy is what's really in those files. But I think, when you look at especially the Russiagate documents published by Tulsi Gabbard in two major batches, the first one back in mid-July, the last one last week, being suppressed to a large degree by mainstream media, which, if they mention it at all, will just let it disappear again and then twist it only by reporting from the standpoint of those targeted, namely the Obama-Hillary circles, and saying, that it's a fraud, and as President Obama said, that that's all false, there's no truth to it. And in reality, what it uncovered, I think, will bring to light the long arc of history, which started immediately after the Second World War in April of 1945, five and a half years before I was born, when Churchill had given the task to his staff to prepare, as I talked about yesterday, Operation Unthinkable, which was the idea in April of 1945 for a preemptive an atomic strike, not nuclear then, an atomic strike against the Soviet Union. I think there's something like 60, it was either 55 or 66 cities that were targeted with atomic bombs. The only problem is we didn't have any. And so the push was to hurry up and develop these bombs as fast as possible to completely obliterate the Soviet Union. And that was being pursued while the Potsdam Declaration was going on, and supposedly the rendering of the world geographically and politically after the Second World War. But that shows the absolute duplicity. Roosevelt, who was trying to stop this, was dead. Truman gave in the orders that, during the Potsdam Conference, gave the orders for the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Churchill was plotting, including the opening up of the Cold War, but at the same time potentially creating a strike against the Soviet Union. Now that's the real topic of Russiagate. And that is why British intelligence was trying to first prevent an election victory of Trump in 2016, and then when he did win the election, to smear him and make his administration as impotent as possible through the Russiagate coverage. Now, I think, what is at stake here? What came out of the Wolfowitz Doctrine, the attempt to establish a unipolar world, regime change in Russia by cutting Russia into several pieces, Well, I'm talking over whatever's going on at K Talk. Now it looks like that might stop. And then the unholy role of the media. That was mentioned recently by Tulsi Gabbard as well, namely Operation Mockingbird. So I think the dissemination of this information as much as possible, to make an attempt to get some maximum coverage worldwide, including in the countries of BRICS and elsewhere. And if this is done in the right way, could lead to a potential unraveling of a lot more evil plots, given the fact that the now U.S. Representative Tim Burchett has formally requested that Soros and his associate Leonard Bernardo, Senior Vice President of the Open Society Foundation, have to testify before Congress about their alleged involvement into the Russiagate affair. And also, this was mentioned in a letter sent on last Friday to House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer, where Representative Burchett urged the panel to call Soros and Bernardo and subpoena them if they refuse to come. Now, what do you suppose Soros is going to do if a subpoena shows up on his desk to come before the U.S. Congress? But at least it's pointing in the right direction and potentially an entry into this entire unholy role of the Soros apparatus that was behind this stuff, which is involved in many of the plots of British intelligence, including the post-Cold War period in the Eastern Bloc countries. Now, I think that is one of the most important things to be watching and understanding what's going on behind the scenes, because you always want to know who that guy is behind the curtain. Now, what it means, this extreme danger and the strategic implication of what all this means is that now, according to Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, Germany and the entire European Union have been renamed as the Fourth Reich. And if you know the history of Russia, their incredible emotional involvement in what was called the Great Patriotic War, and how that makes up the whole identity of Russia in terms of who they define as a model enemy of the Russian Federation, and the fact that Lavrov said that they will now count that into all of their calculations. Think about that for a second. Lavrov says we are renaming them the Fourth Reich. And understanding what these people are doing, these neo-Nazis, including Merz, is doing in their organization against Russia, we see as the Fourth Reich, that will enter into all of our negotiations, our calculations, which means that the role of Germany, first of all, but also the coalition of the willing, which would include Poland, France, and the UK, in terms of being the quintessential image of the enemy of Russia, and what that could potentially mean in the short term. And really, you have to make sure that all the people in Germany know this. The citizens of Germany, excuse me, I'm talking too fast. I'm trying to crowd 2 hours into 1 hour. That the citizens of Germany know what their government's doing. Not only Germany, but the whole European community. The whole world, for that matter. And this is not a bilateral affair between Russia and Germany, even though it should wake up everybody in Germany to this danger. Obviously, the reason for that is that all these different statements and actions that have come out of Merz, who said that he's not afraid of a nuclear war. He actually said that. He said, and that's a quote, I'm not afraid of a nuclear war. He also said, and this, I didn't believe this at first. I thought this was hyperbole, but he was quoted as saying, the Israelis are doing the dirty work for the West. Now, referring obviously back to what the Nazis did in dirty work. What was the dirty work of the Nazis? Excuse me, I'm just dry. What was the dirty work of the Nazis? And now Merz is saying the IDF is doing the dirty work for us. That's an exact quote. And so Lavrov took that quote and said, here's one of the top Nazis of our time. So for the Russians, this qualification of Germany as the Fourth Reich, unfortunately, you can't dismiss this, is because Merz is doing and saying things, including this Kensington Treaty, which he signed with the British, I've talked about in the past, which I think needs to be put into the limelight. Because even now, the British role in the Russiagate was to try to stop any kind of rapprochement between Putin and Trump. And the fact that the British are now calling back for control of their own nuclear weapons, and they want to have their own nuclear force without the U.S. having any say in it. You know, the nukes that are there in, right there on the tip of my tongue, starts with an L, one of the air bases in England. Those nukes are under our control. The Brits don't have any control of it. Now the Brits want complete control of the nuclear arsenal that we built there, without us having any say in it. And it ties Germany through the Kensington Treaty into this kind of an apparatus, which is very deadly for Germany and the Germans. And now that the Russians are saying, okay, we voluntarily stopped the NPT with the limitation of 500 to 5,500 kilometer range land-based missiles. Excuse me, that's not a step towards peace. That's a further step towards nuclear conflict. Now, there is this statement by Professor Jochen Frohwein, emeritus, former director of the Max Planck Institute for International Law. He put out a statement commenting on Lavrov's remarks of calling Germany the Fourth Reich. And he said that there might also be a campaign to reinstitute the enemy clause of the United Nations, given the fact that in the Russian eyes, Germany is potentially becoming an active war party in violating the conditions under which the 4+1 treaty had been signed, which binds Germany to a non-aggressive policy vis-a-vis Russia. And basically, it may make the 4+1 treaty obsolete, which is a very serious matter, because if you look at this any more closely than what I'm talking about, it gives the legal argument that by violating Article 2 of the UN Charter, according to Frohwein, this would apply to Russia defending against German weapons, and therefore a non-nuclear Oreshnik missile could hit either Rheinmetall or any Bundeswehr base and weapons systems on German territory. So this needs to be taken extremely seriously. And the German population, but also everybody else, has to be absolutely made aware of the fact that this is the case. Now, signs that there are more and more people in Germany getting extremely worried is the fact that there are now more than 1,000 people who have recently emigrated to Russia from Germany, and that this is the consequence of that policy. Also, according to another poll, 59% of the German population would not defend themselves if they were attacked. 72% of the women in this poll said they would not defend themselves if they were attacked by Russia, which shows you that the majority of the population does not want to become war ready, as Pistorius is saying. Pistorius is saying Germany must be war ready by 2029, and that rather, deep in their bones, is the remembrance of 2 world wars fought on German territory that did not end well for Germany. All right, the other big story, which is causing a lot of thinking, is this knee-jerk reaction by President Trump and his feud with former Russian President Medvedev, where he said that he would order to put 2 nuclear submarines in the appropriate place closer to the borders of Russia. What's the appropriate place? If you're going to go fight with somebody, what would be the appropriate place to do that? Well, I think that's rather obvious. Now, this has caused a storm of responses internationally. in which the most obvious one from several military experts saying, all this does is prove that Trump has demonstrated that he has absolutely no knowledge about nuclear submarines, how they're deployed, the military doctrine that involves their usage, because of all these submarines are in a permanent rotation place, and you can't just order them to go somewhere else. These Ohio class submarines are a world of military horror in and of themselves, of what they're capable of doing with all the Trident missiles that they're loaded with. Multi-nuclear warhead Trident missiles. One Ohio class submarine, and I believe I've heard numbers as high as 14, but 9 that are actually in the oceans. One can end the world. And so they're on rotation. And why do they need to be on rotation? Because they're not patrolling the oceans like our other submarines are. An Ohio class goes out to a specified area where Naval Command tells them to go, and they sit there, waiting for some signal to move somewhere else. But they just sit there. Why do they sit? Because of the methods that are as a part of the construction of Ohio class submarine to make them stealthy to some degree, more so than other subs. So it's very difficult to detect them if they're not moving. When they're moving, you know where they're at. And so if this actually happened, if this wasn't countermanded by somebody with a half a brain in the Defense Department saying, excuse me, Mr. President, you can't do that. Because in doing that, you just told the Russians where those 2 Ohio-class submarines are. But naturally, the fact that Trump gets himself all worked up in these verbal showdowns, and that FAZ, the Zeitung, had made a comment which is not worth quoting, but there was this classification of a worrying exchange of blows, where among other things, this is a quote from FAZ, the mere fact that an American president is responding personally to a statement of Russia's failed former president is worrying. It raises fears that Trump does not understand who he's dealing with in Russia, and that there's apparently no expert in his entourage who can tell him. With as little as I know of what's going on around this planet, that's been one of my themes all along. He's getting some very bad advice. And then I toss and turn in the middle of the night, wondering how much of what he's deciding to do is bad advice, or because his arm's twisted behind his back with the threat of blackmail. Now, what has caused this shift in Trump's mindset, who started off his second administration with a very credible, honorable effort to normalize Russian relations, and he made important steps with Witkoff, but now he has replaced Witkoff with Kellogg, who is a complete madman in his Russophobia. And obviously, his various dealings with Starmer are very worrisome. Trump's recent meeting with Starmer. And there are a lot of pundits who are claiming that the pressure from the Epstein scandal is causing him to do what he's doing. And it's very difficult to say, and unfortunately, there are other hypotheses as well. That's not the only one. So that definitely should be something to keep in mind. And with that goes, in a certain sense, the worldwide tariff war, which Trump is unleashed, which I think has many unintended consequences. I think the intention of Trump to cause U.S. industry to be reindustrialized as a result is going to be futile, because of the doctrine of tariffs. If you apply them to a nascent industry, as it was argued by the architects of the American system 200 years ago, it's one thing, but if you have an interwoven, complicated world trade system that can only backfire, well, it is backfiring, as we just saw with India. And now the fact that Trump has imposed, for political reasons, incredible tariffs, like this 100% with Brazil because of Bolsonaro, against South Africa because of these supposed human rights violations and racism against white people in South Africa, but also against the EU, against Switzerland of 39%, which has the Swiss extremely worried. It's already caused a certain collapse of the Swiss stock exchange. And in any case, what is done by the capitulation of von der Leyen in her dealings with Trump in Scotland is even more despicable. Basically has created this dynamic between the United States and Europe, whereby Europe is becoming totally energy dependent on the United States. And when you have total energy dependence by another country that you control, you can blackmail them. There are many reports saying that the agreement that von der Leyen made to buy $350 billion worth of oil, gas, and other fuels over 3 years is not really feasible because the United States doesn't have that much to sell, because it would essentially triple the exports, the current exports from the United States to Europe. And the U.S. does not have that. It doesn't have that. And it's also very strange, not very credible, but it does not have, the United States does not have the pipelines and the facilities. And it's designed, what they're trying to do is wipe out any Russian influence in the European energy market. And because of the almost total energy penalty from the United States, it would make Europe even more subject to blackmail and a greater loss of the sovereignty than what they just lost in this deal with Trump. So Trump said in a discussion Friday in a meeting with Lukashenko on the island of Ilam Putin, not Trump, in this Orthodox monastery. The European Union is in big trouble because this recent summit on the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations between the EU and China, where von der Leyen and that crazy idiot Kaja Kallas were in Beijing, missing an incredible opportunity. They're obviously too limited in their intellectual capacity to understand the immense opportunities that would have been offered to Europe in cooperation with China, and instead they repeated the BS about systemic rival and de-risking and all the other rhetoric that's out there. And von der Leyen recently warned of coming China shock and the accusation of Beijing weaponizing trade. In Beijing, she was a little more cautious, but between what she said at the G7 meeting and in Beijing, very mixed signals are being expressed here. And the bottom line is that the European Union is missing out on an opportunity to mend relations with China, which they desperately need right now, because they just came under the heavy boot of the United States trade organizations. And given the fact that the EU is trading partner and China ranks second for the EU, together they account for over a third of the world global GDP. However, this is not a unified position because von der Leyen and Merz are on this anti-China line, but many countries, Spain, Portugal, Italy, the Balkans, Eastern Europe, are breaking away from the EU directive and creating relations direct between themselves and China. And so the war danger is clearly the topic which is in the minds of many people in Germany and Europe. There was a demonstration of several thousand in Berlin on Saturday, and the demands were to leave the EU, to leave NATO, to leave the World Health Organization. And it was a lot of the AfD people, the right-wing people. So but there are others there, but it's definitely part of the peace movement. So the only way the West can get out of this geopolitical insanity that I can see is better relations with the BRICS nations, especially joint ventures in the developments of Africa and the Middle East, because that's what the BRICS nations are offering the countries of Africa and the Middle East, offering them hydroelectric dams, highways, airports, hospitals, schools, trading ports, seaports. And as the president, I think it was of Nigeria at one time said, and what is the United States offering us? Vaccines. Now, in the Middle East, or rather around Gaza, there are also absolutely some breathtaking developments where the topic of genocide is now becoming a major issue inside of Israel. And various organizations and from the entire political spectrum are now using the word genocide inside of Israel. There was a huge demonstration in Tel Aviv on Saturday. Hard to say how many people were there, but they demanded an immediate release of the hostages, but also at the same time protesting what's going on in Gaza. The UN reported that there are 6,000 trucks waiting to get into Gaza. In Belgium, Jordan, Germany, they started airdrops, but they're ridiculously tiny and they're also damaging. Al Jazeera says that there are 20,000 trucks at aid centers waiting to empty their trucks. The breaking development is the fact that Joseph Borrell, already several days ago, he's no longer the European Union High Representative of Foreign Affairs. That's now Kaja Kallas. But he still has his voice, and he had written an article that, according to the European Union legislation, that the EU by law is obliged to impose sanctions on Israel and other legislation that creates a very interesting situation for people like Mertz, who said those unbelievable words about the Israelis doing the dirty work for us. But given that the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice rulings are standing out, Mertz has invited Netanyahu to come to Germany, which does kind of create a noose around the neck of Mertz because he is now implicitly charged to have violated EU legislation. And I think there is an awareness in Germany that this is becoming untenable. And Vadapool, in the ministry that I just mentioned, I think yesterday, who visited Israel for 2 days, supposedly made very sharp warnings about Israel being a friend, and that Israel is threatened with becoming completely isolated in the world. Therefore, they have to change their policy. They cannot annex the West Bank. And in any case, it's just something to note that there is a change. However, this does not mean that the genocide in Gaza is continuing fully, he said. But Israel's National Security Minister, Ben Gvir, was at the Temple Mount. Remember when Ariel Sharon did that like 20 years ago with a big march on the Temple Mount? And that almost brought the world to war? Now, which is probably the next provocation here. But I think the Israeli situation is going to have to soon go in some other way. Either the internal opposition from Israel will get rid of Netanyahu, or that something else is going to change the situation. But in any case, this is getting just more and more serious. I have more to say on this as we go along here. I'm trying. Oh my goodness, it's 1:45. All right, I want to jump down to a couple of other subjects here that are relative to the Gaza. Interestingly enough, NASA is extending the contracts with the Russian language services through 2028. Why would we need Russian input regarding the space program? I think you know the answer to that one. Over 1,000 rabbis and other Jewish leaders from around the world have signed an open letter denouncing Israel's, quote, mass killings of civilians and the use and threat of starvation as a weapon of war. These Jewish leaders say that Israel's actions are destroying Israel's reputation, Jewish values, and Judaism itself. You think? Over the last week, many American Jewish organizations and Jewish leaders, including some of the staunchest supporters of Israel, have been increasingly speaking out about the forced starvation going on in Gaza. Over 1,200 American rabbis have signed an open letter from the American Jewish Committee calling on Israel to allow humanitarian aid. This is from the letter. The Jewish people face a grave moral crisis, threatening the very basis of Judaism as the ethical voice that it has been since the age of Israel's prophets. We cannot remain silent in confronting this. And then back on July 29th, yeah, just a few days ago, 24 rabbis conducted an act of civil disobedience occupying the office of U.S. Senate Majority Leader John Thune. Yeah, you got to be impressed with that. Now, I want to get back to Trump and his submarines for a second. The 2 nuclear submarines that President Trump ordered on July 31st to be positioned in appropriate regions, citing Medvedev, who says they're probably already there. Then Trump said last Sunday night, just the night before last, he said they're in the region where they have to be. So yesterday, the Kremlin spokesman Peskov offered the first Russian response to Trump's submarine threats. He said, overall, of course, we do not want to be drawn into a discussion and comment on this. We approach any statements related to nuclear issues with great caution. As you know, Russia holds a responsible position. President Putin's stance is well known. He also noted that all the parties have to be extremely cautious in their use of nuclear rhetoric. He said Russia takes the issue of nuclear non-proliferation very seriously, and of course we believe that anyone else should be extremely careful when it comes to their nuclear rhetoric. I don't know that if I've ever found a more patient group of people in my life than the Russians for the last 3 years. Now, thousands of workers have walked out in strike at Boeing defense plants. Over 3,200 Boeing workers in St. Louis, St. Charles, Missouri, Muscoda, Illinois, walked out in strike yesterday morning over the wage package that was offered them by management, and they're the ones who are building the fighter jets, including Trump's personal parade number, the F-47, mentioned for the 47th president. And it wasn't just this. Some of them have a conscience, and it's bothering them that they're making weaponry directly involved with the extermination of the Palestinian people. I don't know how far that's going to go. Now, I want to get to Gaza. A former Israeli security official is calling on Trump to stop Netanyahu in Gaza. The group called Commanders for Israel's Security is calling on President Trump to compel Prime Minister Netanyahu to end the war in Gaza. This is from the Jerusalem Post. Said the 3 leaders of the group, former Mossad chief Tamir Pardo, former Shin Bet chief Amy Ayalon, and former deputy IDF chief Matan Vilnai, announced they've sent a letter to Trump asking him to intervene, asking him to stop the Gaza war on behalf of the CIS, Commanders for Israel's Security, which is Israel's largest group of former IDF generals, Mossad, Shin Bet, police, diplomatic corps. We want you to end this war. You did it in Lebanon. It's time to do it in Gaza. Boy, that's really interesting that there would be that kind of rhetoric coming out, because Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu called up on Julian Larison, head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, and demanded that the International Committee of the Red Cross get food and medical care to the remaining living hostages in Gaza, not to the Gazans, not to the Palestinian women and children, the children who you can see the vertebral processes sticking out of their backs. They're so thin. You can see their ribs. You know, if we saw animals like that out in the desert, what would we do here in Utah? We saw starving animals. The Times of Israel said this: the world can no longer remain indifferent in the face of images that recall Nazi crimes. The ICRC then said hostages being held in Gaza must urgently receive the medical care and attention they require. The hypocrisy, my gosh, the hypocrisy of this. So the International Red Cross comes out and says, The Israeli hostages being held by by Hamas need to be taken care of immediately. In the midst of tens of thousands starving Palestinians. I've only got a few minutes left. There's a lot more there I want to talk about, especially Grossman, David Grossman, an Israeli author who's been defensive, finally has come out and called Israel a genocidal state. He said, "For years I refused to use the word genocide, but now I can't help but use it. After what I see in the papers, the images I've seen, the people I was speaking with who were there. How did we come to be accused of genocide?" He says, "Genocide as a word can't be ignored. Once you say it, it just keeps growing like an avalanche." He says he's not being disloyal to the two-state solution. He said he can see no other alternative. But he says that he cannot comprehend the hysteria within Israel over French President Macron's decision to recognize the state of Palestine. Grossman's been is known as a long time peace advocate, whose son was killed while serving in the Israeli army in Lebanon in 2006. The UN ambassador, Danny Danon, D-A-N-O-N, the UN ambassador for Israel, said this the other day: "I don't think there's any starvation in Gaza. There is suffering in Gaza. There are no shortages of aid. If you look at the amount of aid, you have more than enough for Gaza today." He's being interviewed by Wolf Blitzer. Blitzer he himself had a hard time with that. He said, Dannon says, "I'm proud of our democracy. That's a lie. There's no genocide in Gaza. You have to prove intention. We don't have any genocide." My goodness. So Netanyahu's all freaked out now about the pictures of the emaciated hostages. And that still is not moving anybody to do anything. Now, I think I had enough time to get into Ben-Gvir and his Temple Mount provocation. Ben-Gvir, the Kahanist ideologue and national security minister of Israel, openly led a prayer minyan. It's a quorum of 10 Jewish men at the Temple Mount, called, as you know, Haram al-Sharif by the Muslims. And the first time that the far-right leaders being seen in overt worship at this flashpoint site. Now, the Times of Israel reported yesterday, Ben-Gvir was seen leading the Amidah prayer for dozens of other Jews observing Tisha B'Av, a fast day marking the destruction of both ancient Jewish temples that are located atop the Temple Mount. The Mount is now the site of several important mosques and other Islamic sites as well. From the Temple Mount, now this is a quote, "The place where we've proven sovereignty is possible. We must send a message, conquer all of Gaza, declare sovereignty over the entire strip, eliminate every Hamas member, and encourage voluntary emigration. This is the only way that we will return the hostages and win the war." Now, later reports said that the number of Jews who were following Ben-Gvir and these 10 men at 2,000 to 3,000 people. Now, the Palestinian resistance factions condemned Ben-Gvir's provocation as a dangerous escalation and a systematic crime aimed at the complete Judaization of Al-Quds. According to Al-Mayadeen, the Saudi and Jordanian governments, the Palestinian Authority, have also condemned Ben-Gvir's incursions on the Temple Mount. Then, MSNBC, you've heard of Anthony Aguilar. He was the fellow who was interviewed by Tucker Carlson. If you've heard that interview. But MSNBC says, "We're hearing new horrific firsthand accounts about a controversial aid organization in Gaza as starvation grips Palestinians. A report from the United Nations Human Rights Office says nearly 1,400 Palestinians have been killed while seeking food 859 were killed in the vicinity of aid sites run by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and it is a nonprofit based in Delaware, backed by the U.S. and Israel. It's aimed to aid Palestinians without Hamas stealing it. Now, a former GHF contractor is coming forward with firsthand accounts. He's interviewing Aguilar. Anthony Aguilar, join us. Anthony, you're a retired lieutenant colonel in Special Forces. You served in Iraq and Afghanistan for over 2 decades. You joined as a security contractor to help distribute aid in Gaza. What did you see on the ground while you were there? We got a couple of minutes. Thank you for having me, and good evening, everybody. What I witnessed on the ground in Gaza can be described as nothing more than an apocalyptic wasteland. It's human suffering. And for anyone who says that there is no starvation or that the population of Gaza is not at the brink, having crossed the brink of famine, that is irresponsible rhetoric and is only serving to starve the population even further. The population is starving. The population is desperate, and the population needs aid immediately. From my military experience, one of the initial concerns I had when we got to Gaza was that we had not been given a clear and brief review of rules of engagement. We had not received any standard operating procedures for the use of non-lethal munitions. We had not received any rules on escalation of force, because we were going to be dealing with such a large population of civilians, primarily civilians, that we were not there as combatants, we were not there as belligerents, we were there as those who were trying to secure humanitarian aid, and we would be engaging with the civilian population without having the rules of engagement. Escalation of force, standard operating procedures is a dangerous precedent. Furthermore, all of us were there on a tourist visa. So when we entered Israel, we entered as a tourist, and we were expected to do our work in Gaza, armed, securing aid, and engaging with a very large, starving population as tourists. Can you tell us anything about the young boy Amir? No, this is, I can't read this. I burst into tears when I read this. Father killed, mother looking for him, that she was killed, that he was killed, just trying to get aid. God help this planet if this continues. That's all I can say. Oh. God help our species if this continues. For it were better that a millstone be hung around their neck and they were drowned in the depths of the sea than to hurt one of these children. I won't be here tomorrow for a health show. We'll do a replay of a recent program. I'm going up to the standard process farms for a few days, just to stand out in the middle of that 9,500 acre of organic air, organic oxygen. And there's one spot, I need to mention, one spot left for the half off price for a new patient. And we needed to extend it a week because there were people who were on vacation that didn't know about it. So there's one spot left, 801-523-1890. One spot left for the half price. For me to take care of you. And what do I take care of? I take care of the nervous system and any interruption in its normal function that can lead to a whole host of serious consequences. And there's the daily alarm. Well, stick around. Lowell's coming up. And as usual, she'll probably have a very good show for you. I'm sorry for emotions. Sometimes I just go berserk. All right, for those of you on the stream, I appreciate your attendance. If you can like and subscribe, it would certainly help build the audience. But I hope I was able to make my point and get across to you my feelings regarding world affairs. I will see you all Monday.